It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Michael Quinn is director of the CGIAR Excellence in Breeding Platform and lead of the new Accelerated Breeding Initiative. He has extensive experience in the commercial development of germplasm through breeding and research and development management. Prior to EIB, Michael was principal wheat breeder and research and development manager for Eastern Australia at Intergrain, and has over 15 years of breeding, management, and leadership experience in both the private and public sectors, working with hybrid and fixed line crops. We will be sharing the document Accelerated Breeding, Meeting Farmers' Needs with Nutritious, Climate Resilient Crops, which Michael co-authored last year. The title of his presentation today is CGIAR Breeding, Who Benefits and How to Increase Those Benefits. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much. Okay, so like Yanni said, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks very much for this opportunity to address this group. As you mentioned, my presentation is on CG breeding, who benefits and how to increase those benefits. So I really appreciate the opportunity to describe what's going on in CG breeding and some of the things, just a few of the things that we're working on currently. So I'll start from the top. When it comes to germplasm, there are the two actors within the CG is obviously the gene banks and breeding programs. And we have common challenges, and we're both working towards having impact against these five impact areas: the nutrition, health and food security, poverty alleviation, livelihoods and jobs, gender equality, climate adaptation and mitigation, and of course, environmental health and biodiversity. So CG breeding has extremely broad scope, working with 20 crops plus forages, and these crops are of course the same as those that are being maintained in the CG gene. And CG breeding has an extremely wide reach as well. I mean, we've got a broad scope in terms of crops, but also geographically. And this map shows, I mean, we're working across all of the regions across the globe. And what this map seeks to show is how we're partnering with the various countries. I mean, those in blue and green are those who that we're collaborating with, and these countries are the ones that share breeding objectives and market segments for one or several crops. And then those that are in green, of those ones, these are the ones that are receiving the most technical support from CG. And of course, then there are those in orange, which are the regular users. These are countries that are regularly accessing CG breeding materials. So when it comes to germplasm, I mean, farmers are always growing something, and they're either growing land races or older varieties or newly improved varieties, or some mixture and or intercross from any combination of the first three. And so, of course, a farmer that's looking for something different or something that's better will, I mean, this is where they look. They're looking to one of these four areas to find value from germplasm. And of course, it's the goal of breeding to provide value to farmers through newly improved varieties, and again, specifically for one or a number. In most cases, it's providing value for a number of these impact areas. And it's in these same impact areas that we're chasing that the farmer themselves finds value as well. I mean, they're looking often, they'll be consuming this food themselves, so they're looking at the nutritional aspects. They're of course interested in poverty reduction, and our work for women and youth, and I mean, it's going to be important also for the women farmers and the youth amongst the consumers. Climate adaptation is really top of mind for them, because I mean, they're really on the front line of experiencing the impacts of climate change. And of course, environmental health is important for the sustainability of their farming. So we're all trying to find value in the same spaces. And it's, of course, the farmer that defines what from what they derive value when it comes to different germplasm. So, for example, they derive value from a variety that is resilient to drought, or that fetches a higher price, or that tastes good. And so the challenge to breeders and breeding teams is to understand what provides value to farmers, and particularly to a substantial number of farmers in a somewhat variable context. So what do I mean by variable context? Well, I mean, when you talk to farmers about their needs and where they see value, of course, they're experiencing seasonal differences. There's within community differences. I mean, within a village, there can be different farmers that might be going to the same store for new seed at the start of the sowing season, if they're purchasing new seed. And even within the same village, there can be quite different needs from different farmers. And so why do I say a substantial number of farmers? Well, because breeding is appropriate when there are many farmers with similar needs. I mean, breeding is a pipeline. It's a long-term process, and it's expensive, and so for that reason, it's appropriate for large groups of farmers with similar needs. And when we have this situation, then a substantial number of farmers with similar needs, then an improved variety can really provide farmers with a lot of value, and we can have a lot of impact through an improved variety. But we also know that that's not always the case. There are some situations that where there are more niche needs, and very smaller groups of farmers with very specific needs. And so it's for these reasons that breeding is not always a solution for everything. So it's worth being aware of that as well. Well, I think this group knows that, but that we know this as well. And because of this, diversity will always exist, and in itself has value. I mean, it has value for the breeding teams directly, and it has value for these situations where breeding may not be the solution. And of course, I mean, diversity is linked to resilience. I mean, with greater diversity out in the farming systems is greater resilience. And so it's a coexistence of new varieties and land races, and not one or the other. Okay, so just to put on the table early some perceptions about CG breeding early in the presentation here. I think that out there in the community, there is, and rightly so, awareness that CG breeding really has had tremendous impact through more productive, drought-tolerant, disease-resistant varieties. But there's also critiques out there as well, and for example, that CG breeding takes a green revolution approach, that CG breeding's focused only on yield and disease, on breeding for varieties that require lots of fertilizer, and on varieties that work everywhere, perhaps at the expense of and so I want to take the opportunity, using this as a bit of a backdrop, just to describe. I just get a notice that my internet connection's unstable, so please jump in now if I should drop my video. So I want to take the opportunity to describe how CG breeding has changed, and indeed is continuing to change. So starting with the variety releases last year in 2022, of the known variety releases that have derived from CG pipelines, 77% of these were more climate resilient due to selection for tolerance to drought, heat, flooding, etc. 35% are biofortified and or improved food legumes, and helping to reduce malnutrition, in particular among small children and women. And at least 12% both. And so in terms of the types of varieties that are being developed, the picture is changing. And CG breeding is changing further. We're really putting a strong emphasis on better understanding farmers' needs and ensuring that we're breeding for farmers' needs. We're looking at the breeding process itself and the way it's structured so that we can improve linkages between trait discovery and the variety development teams, and indeed between trait discovery and the gene banks. We're looking to implement new tools and methods of breeding so that we can increase the effectiveness of conventional breeding. And we're looking at how we can be more effective in our partnerships, and more specifically moving towards a system where we're developing co-developing varieties with our partners. And so, pardon me, back to the first point, I want to use 3 examples of the ways in which we are seeking to and working towards understanding farmers' needs and breeding for farmers' needs. So first of all, through having a greater emphasis on the package of traits needed. Often there's a lot of talks, there's a lot of talk about traits, and but really the farmer doesn't see a trait, they see a variety and they see a package of traits, and that's what gets ultimately delivered to the farmer. And so that's what we need to be considering when we're in our breeding. And so we're really looking to understand what is the package of traits that is going to be delivering value to farmers. And just to use the West African cassava program as an example, and to use a target product profile from the cassava team. And the target product profile is the description of the variety that is being targeted for development for maximum value and impact. And so in this example, the cassava team are working towards and breeding for post-harvest deterioration, mealiness, taste, multi-purpose use, for example, fufu, disease resistance. They're working on cooking time, low cyanogenic potential, and of course, production yield. And this is not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a bit of a flavor of some of the things that a single program be working towards. And across the CG, each crop, each of the 20 crops plus forages are currently reviewing between 5 to, in some cases, over 30 of these target product profiles in view of the needs of farmers, consumers, and markets. Okay, so the next example of how we're moving forward in this space is to ensure that the varieties are being developed perform under smallholder farmers' conditions, which are very often quite suboptimal, as you all know. So just to use what the maize program in Southern Africa have been doing, they've the way they're tackling this, and this is an example of how the direction we're going in many of the crops, is to test performance on farm. And the maize program Southern Africa did this in 2021 or 21 across 21-22 season across 5 countries, and with 720 trials on farm under farmers' conditions and under farmer management. And if you look at the map on the right here, it's a little bit difficult to see, but you can see these dots, and these dots are the locations. It's a little bit hard to see that there's 720 of them, but there are. And these are the locations of these on-farm trials across South Africa, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Mozambique, and Zambia. And over 37% of these trials were managed by women farmers, and they were conducted through partnerships with NARS, seed companies, NGOs, and others. So it really is a partnership approach to getting this done. And when these on-farm trials are conducted, it's, yes, important to understand the performance of the varieties, but there's also a huge opportunity to collect feedback from farmers directly, and in particular, gender disaggregated feedback. And from this, we can understand more directly what is providing value to farmers including what's providing value specifically to women farmers. And similarly for rice in South Asia and East Africa, the rice team, for their final stage advancements in 2022, made these advancements together with over 40 partners and based the decisions on trial data from 53 locations, which included, again, farmer feedback. And now the third example, I'm using the potato program to really highlight that we want feedback from men and women farmers and consumers. And the potato program did a fantastic job of understanding farmers' needs. Last year, they had 460 on-farm potato trials in East Africa, and from this, they learned that the farmers in Rwanda prefer the varieties that were released before 1990. And they learned that the traits that are driving farmer preference are yield, taste, marketability after storage, and tuber quality. So some really challenging and difficult traits there. And this led to updating the target product profile. So this really had direct impact on what the program is targeting and their priorities and what they're selecting for. And this really highlights the challenge of variety replacement, particularly when you see that the list of traits together with the reality that the farmers are preferring older varieties. And this is not a CG unique problem. I mean, replacing potato varieties in Europe, I mean, it has exactly the same challenge, where the currently grown varieties are hard to displace because of the same reasons. Some of these end use and consumer traits are really difficult and they're really difficult to understand what it is specifically about the currently grown varieties that is desirable and that needs to be retained or built upon. And then, of course, from there, even once you do understand it, the next challenge is how to measure these end use preferences, like particularly the hard ones like taste, at large scale during the breeding process, because that's what's required in order for us to develop varieties that are ultimately going to get adopted, and that's how they have impact. So that's the challenge to the breeding teams and the thing that we're working on. Okay, so finding priority traits. This is linked with this, and is also how we're looking to have greater impact. So we've gone through a systematic revision of target product profiles, which gives us a much better indication of which traits are the highest priority. We've also done a system-wide stock taking of 350 CG trait discovery and deployment activities. And from this, I mean, we learned that around a third are focused on biotic stresses, around a quarter on abiotic stresses, and around a quarter on nutritional and end-use traits. And so some of the conclusions that come from this analysis, and by the way, this is the first time that we've been able to have a top-down holistic view across the whole CG, because it's the first time that I mean, with accelerated breeding, we've got all of breeding within CG breeding within a single initiative, whereas in the past it was across different CRPs. It's the first time we've been able to have this complete picture. And what are some of the conclusions that come from this analysis? Well, first of all, farmers really are valuing end-use traits. I mean, this is really driving the adoption of new varieties and or the retention of some of their old varieties, because they like the end-use traits of what they're currently growing. Many traits that are bringing the most value are difficult to work with, and this is, if you think about it, probably no great surprise. I mean, if they were easier to deal with, then perhaps we would have achieved them already. And when I say difficult to deal with, I'm talking about traits that have got complex inheritance. Some of these traits are controlled by hundreds, and in some cases even thousands of genes, and or we're having to use suboptimal donor sources. And I'll talk a little bit later about donor sources. we learn that we're not always selecting for and or looking for the most important traits. And so, I mean, the great work that the potato program has done highlights this, that there's learnings to be had that we can incorporate into, and we can course correct what we're breeding for, so that we can be breeding for the most important traits and be providing greater value to farmers. And trait discovery and deployment and variety development are not always completely aligned. And this is not specific to CG. I mean, this happens in the private sector as well, where trait discovery work may get left on the shelf. And I mean, there's plenty of examples globally, and like I said, inside and outside of the CG, of trait discovery work that doesn't make its way through to farmers' fields. And I mean, specifically, there are examples of traits that the trait discovery team might work on that isn't taken up by the variety development team. And when that's the case, then there is no pathway to impact for that work. There's no opportunity for it to find its, or limited opportunity for it to find its way through to a variety in farmers' fields. And sometimes it's that the trait discovery team are working on a trait that actually isn't high priority, but sometimes it is that they have, but it's the variety development team that aren't prioritizing that trait. And so that's something that I'll talk about soon in terms of what we're doing to address that. But specifically on donor sources and thinking about, from a breeder's perspective, where do traits come from? So breeders will select from one of the these four donor sources. The first place they'll look is within their own breeding program, when they're trying to bring in more genetic variants for a particular trait, or trying to bring in a new trait. They'll look within their own breeding program because that's the material that is improved and adapted. If they can't find it there, they'll look to other material from other breeding programs. This may not be adapted, but at least it's already improved. And if they can't find it there, then they might look to local land races, because these might have at least some level of adaptation. But often these are not available because we're breeding for a region that is outside of the center of origin for that particular species. And so the last place to try and look for variants or for donor sources is amongst exotic land races or closely related species. And it's normally in this order of preference because of breeding ease and development costs and so forth. In terms of highlighting the linkage with the gene banks community, I mean, it's numbers 3 and 4 that are typically sourced from gene banks. And it's in terms of linking with the trait discovery, it's the sources from numbers 2, 3, and 4 often going through a trait discovery and deployment pipeline before becoming apparent in a variety development program. And so just a little bit more about the challenge, I guess, of using some of these less adapted and unimproved sources, and the challenge of bringing in new traits. I mean, I guess in one way, elite adapted variety is a little bit like a high performance vehicle, and can be analogous in this example to a high performance vehicle, where both have carefully brought together many complex components. And when you've got something that is really complex and elite, and you're wanting to add something to it, if you're wanting to add a trait to, in this example, we've got an SUV, if we're wanting to retain the comfort and the ability to seat 5, but you want the utility of a pickup, then ideally the two of them would go together and you would have a nice modern pickup like this. But the reality is that it doesn't really work like that. And when you're trying to add a complex trait from a donor that is really very different, like in this example, then it looks a little bit more like this. And so there's still work to be done to try and bring it together to something that is a package of traits that is what that is aligned with what the farmer is looking for. So there are challenges with trait discovery. And so what is our response to the trait discovery and deployment challenge? First of all, to be really on top of the prioritization of traits. We can't be doing this for every potential trait that is going to have value. We need to be really honed in on those traits that are having the highest value, and in particular, looking at the likelihood of success. I mean, I mentioned earlier that there are many examples of trait discovery work that doesn't find its way to farmers' fields. Well, some of that is because the trait discovery part of that pipeline was not successful. So first of all, what's the likelihood of success, and what is the expected time and cost of success, and weighed up against the expected impact? When we're talking about impact, we're talking about value to farmers and to civil society. The next thing we're doing is to have formal and closer linkages of trait discovery with the variety development programs, and indeed between trait discovery with the gene banks, in particular when it comes to, for example, sourcing donor sources. So I talked earlier about some of the challenges in this space. What we're doing to overcome those challenges is to be very clear about the handover points. Be very clear about what the product is that gets handed over from the trait discovery team to the variety development team, and being very clear on what sort of time frame, what that product looks like, and what sort of background. And so to tighten up that link and to formalize some of these expectations and deliverables, and in the first place, making sure that we've got total alignment on the value of these traits as well, so that we've got the trait discovery pipelines, which are hugely important and can provide huge amount of value, are really focused on the traits that are going to be taken up most readily by those variety development teams, and in turn packaged up into a variety and provided to farmers. And so with and in terms of the linkage between trait discovery and gene banks, I mean, and this is a really important take-home message from this presentation, that collaborative research is required, including with the gene bank community and with farmers, and primarily on these 2 points. First, to understand the traits of value, from which traits are really providing value to farmers and going to have the most impact, and identification of the best donor sources. So that's a really important collaborative research that's required. And when it comes to understanding traits of value, I mentioned earlier the importance of end use characteristics, and farmers are repeatedly showing this link that they to value and of end use characteristics. And of course, it's improving what farmers value is how we provide benefits. So we need to be really ensuring we're incorporating this into our breeding. And if I use the blue maize in Mexico as an example, farmers in Mexico had land races, blue maize land races, which they valued, but there were no improved varieties until CIMMYT made the decision and then went ahead and developed improved blue maize varieties. And once these were developed, there was really huge demand, as you can see from the headline of this article on the right there. Now, this may not be a mainstream example, but it simply highlights what is possible with greater end-use focus. And the reality is that there are many more examples like this for us to explore together, in particular for some of the crops where end-use traits are really important, like the RTB crops and rice. I mean, rice is there's many different end-use types, and how can we explore what's going to have value and ensure that we're breeding for those package of traits for the farmers that we're targeting. So this is where collaborative research is going to be ongoing. Okay, so the second challenge in this space is really is to to breed varieties that make a step change, that really have a significant value proposition to the farmers. Because for farmers to recognize, well, farmers find it hard to recognize a difference in their fields, and it's because they are growing the varieties across different fields, across different sowing times, across years. And so with all these differences, it is really, I mean, they don't have a neat side-by-side comparison with a set of scales and a statistician on hand. So it's really difficult for them to, particularly for some traits. I mean, for traits like disease and maturity, yes, it's more obvious. But for some of the more quantitative traits like yield, it can be really difficult for them to see the difference, and they need to in order to make that change. I mean, farmers will change variety when they observe a noticeable difference and can observe that benefit. That's when they'll pick up the variety. So that's what we need to be putting in front of them. So how do we do that? What do we need to be thinking of from a breeding perspective? Well, I mean, considering that breeding cyclical process, and by what I mean by that, well, first of all, progenies are created, and the best of these are selected for recycling, and then intercrossed to generate the next generation of material. So that's the whole cycle. And the faster that the breeding team can turn this cycle, then the more likely a desirable trait combination can be developed, and of course delivered faster. But I mean, just the chance of success and the chance of creating that step change goes up significantly. And this is what we refer to as accelerated breeding. And modern breeding tools and approaches enable breeders to turn this cycle faster. And it's just to make a side note here that it's not just that that if you add a new breeding tool, if you add genomic selection to a current approach, that suddenly this will happen. It's more so that we're changing the way breeding is done, and these tools enable those changes. So it's not just adding the use of these tools, it's what they enable, the changes they enable in the breeding process. And so I want to give an example of some of these changes that are being implemented using the East Africa Bean Program. So first of all, the East Africa Bean Program, it's really targeting some very challenging traits and package of challenging traits. They're looking at cooking time, nutritional content, multiple disease resistances, yield, among other traits. And so to deliver this step change in varieties, they've implemented speed breeding, which includes rapid generation advance. This means that from making the cross or hybridization, they then go on to the selfing stages and get to field testing as quickly as is biologically possible, and then test in the field, and then from that very first year of field selection, they select their parent for recycling and the next round of crosses. And so that's the whole cycle, and they do this within a 3-year period. And so this is what we refer to as a 3-year breeding cycle. And just by way of comparison, there are other legume programs that are running a 6-year cycle, and indeed it's not uncommon to come across some programs that might have even a 12+ year breeding cycle. So with all other things being equal, which is possible within the breeding process, then this just significantly drives higher rates of genetic gain, but importantly, the likelihood of success of developing that step change variety that is going to be adopted and ultimately by farmers and ultimately having impact. So just some of the other changes that they've implemented, they're using genomic relationships, using molecular markers for more accurate selection of parents. Now, this is critically important because if you're trying to select parents from a single year of trials, rather than having the luxury of 4 or 5 years worth of trials, then anything that can be done to increase the accuracy of parent selection, like using the genomic relationships, is really important, and it has a really big impact. And another way in which they can achieve that confidence of what they're selecting for is through the use of managed stress trials, which they're also doing. And so they've got managed stress trials together with on-farm trials so that they can understand performance of farmer relevant conditions across a range of different environments that can be created within a single year without having to wait for those natural conditions to come around over a number of years. By using managed stress trials, then you can do that within a single year, and having on-farm trials gives the performance on farm, which I talked about just earlier. Okay, but it's not just within the breeding process that we're making changes; it's also how we're partnering, and so I want to use the yam breeding network in East Africa as an example to show that when we're changing how we're doing the breeding, but also how we're partnering. So we're increasingly looking to move from a situation where it's the CG program, which is developing candidate varieties and then sharing those with partners, to working more closely with partners much earlier in the process so that we're co-developing the candidate varieties and using the YAM network as an example. They're working with 14 partner organizations, and these include private companies like GoSeed, include NARS like CSIR, the Crops Research Institute, and includes universities like Ebonyi State University. And these are regional programs. I mean, this one is working across Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Nigeria. And so this is the YAM network, but the CG has 36 of these such networks across the various crops and regions that we're working. And many of these breeding networks are at a regional level. So this is the map that I showed earlier in the presentation. And yes, we're partnering with these countries, and but often these breeding networks are working at a regional level, and this is acknowledging the fact that within a region there are often very similar needs of farmers across countries within a region. So this comes back to the point I made earlier about having substantive groups of farmers with similar needs. So who is involved and who is benefiting from these partnerships? Well, CG has over 1,000 crop-specific germplasm collaborations with an estimated 600 institutions in over 100 countries that arise from these 36 crop by region breeding networks. And these institutions include NARS, include universities, and private or parastatal companies. And these ones are often they're scaling partners. Like I mentioned earlier, the main target countries are the low income and lower middle income countries, or at least that's the point I was trying to make with that map that was up at the beginning of the presentation. But it's also upper middle and high income countries that are interested in some of our germplasm. I mean, primarily wheat and legumes, and also some others that are important to fewer countries or are less transferable than wheat or the legumes, like, for example, maize. But my point here is that we really are providing benefits to a very broad range across globally. So that was the partnership analysis. So what are some of the insights from this partnership analysis? Well, firstly, CG has a hugely relevant breeding agenda. We wouldn't have 600 institutions regularly accessing breeding materials if this weren't the case. We see that open access is regularly practiced. We see that the role of the private sector is increasing, and this is a really good thing. CG doesn't release varieties. It's often the NARS or private sector that is going through the release process, and that's our pipeline to impact. And so involvement of the private sector is a really good thing. And even if they get involved with breeding, I mean, that can be a really good thing as well. And while many positive changes are occurring, we can do even better, including by strengthening the role of NARS and their engagement. So what are the areas of our ongoing work with our partnership approaches? Well, first of all, I mentioned earlier in the presentation the importance of on-farm trials. For these, we are completely reliant on our partners. And so having stronger partnerships is important for us to be conducting more on-farm trials, which is certainly our goal. We're wanting to enhance the breeding capacity of NARS, and this is win-win for both sides. I mean, like I said, we're looking to partner more with them than we have in the past for the development of candidate varieties. Pardon me. And if we're partnering with stronger NARS, then the whole partnership just works better. It's obviously beneficial for the NARS themselves if we worked with them on enhancing their breeding capacity, but it's win-win for us as well. But also enhancing the ownership by NARS of these candidate varieties. And like I said before, CG doesn't release varieties. Often it's the NARS or the private sector, and even then the NARS are often partnering with them. And so if the NARS are more engaged and more involved in the development of varieties, then they're going to feel a greater sense of ownership. And when it comes to the release stage, and when it comes to working with farmers and the extension side, the downstream linkages, then that material is going to be more likely to have impact. So NARS CG synergies resulting in more effective breeding, and I just mentioned the synergies for downstream linkages, but even for the breeding, I mean, this is really just to say that we do it better when we do it together. I mean, there's breeding capacity within the NARS, there's breeding capacity within CG, and when we work together, it's a synergistic relationship, and we're just more effective together. And informed setting of breeding goals. Earlier on, I was talking about the importance of understanding what brings value to farmers. Well, it's the NARS that are on the ground, and they're the ones that really can be providing critically important insights about that help us understand what it is that will bring value to farmers. But also, we're wanting to ensure alignment between national and network priorities. I mentioned earlier that a lot of these breeding networks operate at a regional level. Well, what the regional breeding network is breeding for must align with the national priorities of the countries within that region, because that's how we have the greatest impact. And so through these partnership approaches, we can better achieve that alignment. Okay, so just wrapping up now, I'm coming to the end. So just some concluding statements, and to wrap up the presentation, our overarching goal is to provide benefit to farmers and to civil society at large. And that CG breeding is changing and implementing changes so as to increase these benefits. That's really our goal with the changes that we're implementing, so that we can increasingly be providing greater and greater benefits to farmers and to civil society. And we do this through greater alignment of breeding with what provides the greatest benefit to farmers. We do it by implementing new breeding approaches, and wide partnerships are crucial for achieving this. And collectively, we talk about this as being in accelerated breeding initiative, we talk about being more focused, about being faster, more collaborative and equal. And this is what we're referring to when you see that statement. And finally, the take-home message that I mentioned earlier is that collaboration with the gene bank community is really essential to better understand traits of greatest value and to identify high value donor sources. And this is my last slide, just to make some acknowledgements before wrapping up. There really was a huge effort by the CG breeding community for the Accelerated Breeding Initiative technical report to show our progress in 2022. It was it was the first year of the initiative last year, and so it was our first report. And so there was a huge effort by the breeding community to contribute to that report. And it was from those contributions that I pulled these examples that I that I referred to in this presentation. So first of all, huge thanks to all of the team for that, and even for those outside of these examples, to all my colleagues from across the CG, from the Alliance of CGIAR and Biodiversity, Africa Rice, CIMMIT, SIP, ICARDA, ITA, and IRI. These are the breeding centres in the CG. To our national partners, thank you, and to the Accelerated Breeding Initiative team, and to the Market Intelligence Initiative team with whom we partner strongly, and in particular on a lot of these things that I talk about in this presentation. And of course to the CD, all of this possible through their funding. So once again, I really for me today just to what's going CG breeding. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was wonderful. Really an eye-opener. 1,000 germplasm collaborations in 600 countries, in 600 institutions, and with 136 countries. That's pretty big, pretty wonderful to know, and we wish you the best of luck with that. We have about 10 or 11 questions. If you have the patience, we'll go through them one by one, if it's okay. The first one is from Nelisa Hamora. Why is the selection of priority traits top-down approach? Why is it not driven by user demand?
I'm not sure I understand the question, because it really is driven by user demand. I mean, feel free to put the person on speaker if you like, but I mean, just the short answer is that's where we start, by understanding what's going to provide value to the farmer or to the end user.
Okay, Nelisa, would you like to clarify, please? I think she is online.
She may have been referring to my 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's not really to say. I mean, that was more around where we source germplasm, more so than deciding what the traits are, which is a different. I mean, that exercise comes about once we understand what it is that we're trying to target, and then we go looking for where to find it.
Okay, good. In this, the year of the International Year of Millets, is the CGIAR breeding increasing focus on millets and advocating its use? Just jumps around. Advocating its use by consumers in different parts of the world. So Year of the Millet, or Year of Millet.
Yes.
Is there anything this person would like to know how you're focusing on that and what particular activities are related to?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the short answer is yes. Millets were previously bred by ICRISAT, which, and as we all know, ICRISAT chose not to join 1CG, and so as the decision was made that CG wanted to stay in millet breeding, and indeed with many of the other crops like sorghum and groundnut that ICRISAT were breeding. And so yes, millet programs in sub-Saharan Africa starting up, and I mean, it is challenging because they are getting started. I mean, but the short answer is yes, we're breeding for millets, and they were on that list of the 20 crops.
Okay, thanks. From Nora Castañeda, how do CG breeders interface with gene banks, and what do they specifically need from them?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I think it's primarily at that trait discovery point, because it's they're the ones that are going to be having the greatest level of interaction with gene banks, and it really comes down to those two areas that I had in my presentation. So first of all, I think that the gene bank community are a part of can provide a part of the answer to the question of what it is that farmers are valuing, because they are, I mean, they're often they may be filling requests in different regions for different types of germplasm, and so I think they're part of that that answering that question of what is providing value. And then once we understand that, then going through those 4 different areas that the breeders will be sourcing donor sources, 2 of them are coming very often from the gene banks. So when we can't find sufficient genetic variants from the first 2, then that's where we have a conversation with the gene banks to say, okay, let's work together. How do we find amongst these potential sources the best donor? Because even within each of those categories, there's going to be more and less suitable donor sources. So I think they're the 2 areas for collaboration.
Okay. From Charlotte Lustine, what is the decision-making process in terms of making intermediate materials available to national breeding programs that may be better positioned to take the product forward? Or is CG only focused on the entire pipeline directly to farmers?
Absolutely not only focused on that. I fully agree with what she's suggesting here, and this is the whole purpose of these breeding networks. And when I talk about co-development of varieties, I mean, for them to be for our partners to be much more involved much earlier in the process, and to have that co-ownership. So I mean, if they find something that they see value in, then they use it, and they start using it as soon as possible and as much as possible.
And by they, you mean the national breeding program?
Yes. Well, our partners, which are often the national breeding programs, but also with small and medium enterprises that we might be partnering with as well. I mean, the same thing can apply. So I use the word partner broadly, but definitely, I mean, in many cases, I'm talking about the NARS, but I'm not being exclusive about that.
Wonderful. From Nora Castañeda, do CG breeding programs calculate the contribution that CG gene banks make to their overall impact? That's a kind of difficult one, but how do you calculate, or can you calculate the impact of a gene bank, the contribution of a gene bank to its breeding program?
This is so tough, because you have to have some, I mean, just about any variety will trace back eventually to material that has come from the gene bank. And so one question is, well, how far back do you want to look? And it's really challenging. So you have to put some, I think you have to first make some assumptions and be clear about what those assumptions are. And then one of the first and easiest ones is, well, how far back are you talking, and how recently are you talking? And even then it's really hard, because if you have to go, because of the reasons that I pointed out in the presentation, if you're going back to material from the gene bank, if you've got a less mature breeding pipeline for a particular region, then perhaps that material will more quickly find its way into farmers' fields. If you've got a very mature program with highly elite lines that's benefited from many years of breeding, then material from the gene bank can have huge value, but it's going to be a long process. And so for those reasons that I put into the presentation, and so it's going to be, once it eventually does have impact, which could be very large impact and very worthwhile, it's going to have started some time ago. And so it really comes down to how far back you're looking as a starting point, that it's challenging for a number of reasons.
Right. Well, if I could insert my own question here, I actually read through your ABI document that you produced last year, and it has very specific targets, and there's a 3-year sort of end of initiative outcome. 2 of them. One of them is to strongly increase the rate of genetic gain delivered to farmers by 1.5 per annum. That already is a big thing by 2030. But the second one, it's a little bit worrisome, because what you stated at the beginning of your talk, and that is that you intend to reduce the average age of varieties in farmers' fields to less than 15 years by 2030. The ones, the farmers' fields, the varieties that are in farmers' fields. So seeing as they prefer the stuff that has been bred before 1990, and you want to replace the farmer varieties, to less than 15 years, so modern varieties by 2030. How do you bring those two things together, what the farmer really is aiming at versus what your goals are in this 3-year outcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what is behind that? What's implicit behind that end of initiative outcome? And we were very limited for words in that proposal. What's behind that is that we're trying to, but we're ensuring the parts I put in the presentation about understanding what brings value. That's what we're trying to address there. What we're saying is if we get that right, then the outcome is going to be that farmers will see value in what we're developing, and they will adopt it. And the outcome of that, the indicator for that is more modern varieties being grown. So it's not to say that we want farmers growing stuff that they don't want. It's to say we need to do a better job of developing what farmers want.
Exactly.
And what brings them value.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think Faye is going to share that with you in case you do want to see that document. It's a really interesting document with some very specific numbers, and I found it eye-opening. I hope that many of those outcomes do come around. Very ambitious, and I hope they do come around. From Nelissa Hamora, where do CG breeders source materials primarily? Are CG gene banks the main source, or are there other important alternate sources?
Yeah, good question. It really depends on it's very much a case-by-case basis on crop by crop and for what trait you're talking about. I mean, for the most part, most programs are recycling their elite material, and if they've got quite a mature program, if they're not needing to bring in any new traits, if they've got sufficient genetic variation, then it'll be a fairly closed system. If they're moving to a new region, or if they get new market intelligence that tells them that there's a trait that they're missing out on, or they're needing, and they don't have the variance within the material, that's when we're going to have to go searching for more genetic variants. And again, it's going to be very case by case, and it's going to go through those systematically through those four, that list of 4 potential options. And even within each of those 4, like I said, there's more and less suitable options. So it's very case by case. And yeah, I mean, like I said in the presentation, when it comes to related species and land races, yeah, it's almost exclusively gene banks that these are sourced from. Yeah.
Okay. Another very interesting question from Isabel Lopez Noriega. Thank you for your very nice presentation, Michael. Across CGIAR mandate crops, which ones can still benefit a lot from breeding, and which ones seem to be reaching the limit of what genetic improvement can offer? I've heard chickpea breeders saying that it's hard to develop new Kabuli varieties that are better than the ones that they often use as reference ones. Do you have this perception in relation to other CGIAR crops, or perhaps just the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, it's really a case of first of all, I don't believe that we're hitting the genetic limits of any of the crops that we're working in. So just to put that on the table, I think, but that's not to say that we're not really challenged in some areas. And I think the challenge is more around understanding what are the traits, and sometimes we can know that it's taste or something that's really difficult, but then okay, what is it specifically? How do we, and I had this in the presentation, I mean, how do we incorporate that at scale within the breeding process so that we can select for it? That's one thing we have to understand. So the first is we have to understand the trait. The second is we have to know how to incorporate it into the selection process. And the third is we have to have genetic variants for that trait. And that's again where gene banks can come into play, particularly when we're needing to use those third and fourth options. So yeah, I mean, I don't believe that we're at the genetic limits. It's really about overcoming these challenges that I put into the presentation.
Okay. From Grace Mehar, what methods are used for biofortification of varieties to increase nutritional value for women and children? So in what
Yeah,
ways are
good.
you looking, yeah, for and what methods do you use to introduce biofortification?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, it depends on what the trait of interest is, but I mean, it's quite often zinc or iron or vitamin A. And first of all, there needs to be an impact hypothesis that for example, by increasing the vitamin A content of this particular crop, then we will have this impact on this group of consumers. And then we just set about selecting for that trait, and we set targets, and we ensure that there's genetic variance within the breeding germplasm that we're working with. And with each parental selection, I mean, coming back to breeding being a cyclical process, with each parental selection, we look at the performance or the concentration of that particular target trait, whether it's zinc or iron or vitamin A or some combination of those, in those parents. And we ensure that we are using the parents that on balance across all the traits that have been targeted, which would include, in these examples, would include those nutrition traits that are the very best parents. And then we just iteratively build upon that with every cycle. And again, we turn that cycle as fast as possible. And I mean, I guess to be a bit more specific, I mean, we do select directly for, we will measure in that potential parental material, for example, the concentration of zinc or iron or whatever the target is.
Okay. You doing okay? We still have a few more, maybe 4 or 5. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
All right. Are there crop-wise traits identified for accelerated breeding through modern crop breeding, like genome editing approaches?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but just to say that we do have
CRISPR versus traditional. That's what I think they mean. Other than traditional breeding methods, is there anything used like
okay.
CRISPR or something like that?
Yeah, okay, good question. So, I mean, basically for everything that we're able to use conventional breeding, we're using conventional breeding. And I think gene editing is a really fantastic opportunity, particularly for those traits for which we're not able to handle through conventional breeding. I mean, and just to say also that there is a separate initiative just on gene editing, and my next point is that gene editing is really most applicable for simply inherited traits. I mean, you can't. It's not very easy to go and edit 100 different genes. So it's simply inherited traits, and particularly for simply inherited traits for which we don't already have genetic variants, because if we did, then the easiest, most cost-effective, before you even start talking about regulation, ways to do it using conventional breeding. So short answer is yes, we are looking at gene editing. It has there are very specific situations where it's appropriate, and there's an initiative on that.
Okay, good. From Melissa, how do you define high value sources? Traits of high value? That's the question. What is your measure of value? It's a little bit philosophical, but how do you measure value? What is valuable to you, and how do you measure it in a breeding program?
Well, it really comes back to the farmer. I mean, what value does the farmer put? What benefit does it bring to the farmer? And I mean, first of all, if they don't see value in it, they don't adopt it, and so it has no impact at all. But so we need to be providing them with a package of traits that they see value in, and this is, yeah, you're right, it is a little bit philosophical, but I mean, this is part of the challenge that we need to understand. We need to understand better what value the farmer will put on one trait versus another, and then that guides us. And the other thing that we need to be considering when looking at different traits is the likelihood of success, because not all, some need to be sourced from wilder material than others, and some are more simply inherited than others. And the more complex the inheritance, the more challenging it is to work with, and the more the more difficult to work with the donor source, the lower likelihood of success. So we incorporate that together with the impact of being successful with the trait. So how much benefit will it bring to the farm? We put all of that together and say, okay, well, how do they're the different things that we look at to make a decision on how we prioritize traits, which I think is what she's really getting at. Sorry, I think I didn't catch who it was that asked the question.
Yeah, Melissa. Yeah.
Yeah.
From Michael Halewood, we have a question regarding those three numbers that you threw out, the 1,072 collaborations with 600 institutions in 136 countries. So he says, amazing numbers regarding collaborators. Can you say more about the systems CGIAR has in place to get feedback from farmer organizations to inform breeding priorities? What is your feedback mechanism with 1,000 collaborations with 600 institutions in 136 countries? How do you get feedback from them? How do you process the feedback to inform those breeding priorities?
Yeah, great question, because the scope is huge and it's not easy. I think the first thing is that, I mean, coming back to that map that I had, I mean, we are working with some of these countries more closely than others. And I mean, in the second time I had that map, I referenced that we're doing this across 30, that these come out of these 36 breeding networks. So as soon as we start talking 36, we're talking about a more manageable number. And it's each of these 36 breeding networks have coordinators, and they're working with the, and some of these countries we're working, and that was the point that I had up when I put that map up the first time. Some of these countries we're partnering with much more closely than others, and it's with those that we're really partnering with most closely, particularly on the development of the germplasm itself, where we're wanting to hear from them and from the farmers in those countries specifically, where they're deriving value. And yeah, I mean, suddenly when you've got 36 networks, each with their own network coordinator, you're at a more manageable number. It's still a challenge, and we're having to work closely with market intelligence, because the information is coming from different players in the value chain. But suddenly it's manageable, and we're making progress, and we are. I mean, just even looking at the example with the potato program, I mean, they just from that 1 year of on-farm trials and getting that feedback, they updated their target product profile and they changed what it is that they're breeding for. So it's happening, and it is doable.
Okay. From Christelle Rabil, what are the steps that breeding and gene bank communities can take to better link back to the gene banks where the breeding material is originally sourced from? In other words, how can the gene bank obtain that information that was useful for the breeders so that they in turn can conserve that information in their data, and perhaps even distribute some of these lines that were useful for breeding programs? It's the other way around from the previous question, is how can we collect that information that was useful for breeding programs and then retain it within the gene bank?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I guess the question is, what do you do with that information? Because once you learn of successful contribution, I mean, you would probably use that you'd probably use that successful product as the next donor source, rather than going back to that original one. That's the first thing. But of course, you want to understand this for attribution purposes, which is getting back to the first time this was asked, and it's not the other way around, like you say. It's yeah, it's a good question. It really comes down to, again, I mean, over what sort of timeframes you're looking to understand this, and for what purpose. But I think, and the other thing to be aware of is that we don't know. I mean, when something is sourced from the gene bank, we're using it for some time before we know that it's successful or not. And it might be quite some years before we understand that it's been successful. And then, but then but I do acknowledge that it's useful to have mechanisms in place so that we can feed that information back and say, hey, that material which we sourced 10 years ago, look where it is now, look at what it's doing, and look what it's contributed to. Yeah, I'm not sure what the answer is, to be honest, but it would be useful to have mechanisms in place to be able to do that.
It's a challenge within gene banks as well. I mean, we do try to broaden the knowledge base, trying to get information from the users to be able to better serve other users that might be looking, for example, for drought tolerance or frost tolerance or something like that. But it's difficult to make that link because of the years that have to pass before you even know something is successful.
That's right.
So from Eduardo Ryabchenko, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It would be interesting to have a more extensive presentation specifically for the most popular crops to grow. It would be useful for me to hear about corn, prospects, breeding problems, etc. Just a comment from M. Kashfir. How is CGIAR system, or how can CGIAR system strengthen the community seed banks and ensure in situ conservation? Good point. So you're talking about farmers. The question is about in situ conservation. How can CGIAR system and perhaps breeders ensure community seed banks and ensure in situ conservation?
Yeah. I'm not sure. Maybe you're in a better position to answer that question, Yanni, than I am. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, it's it's really the gene bank community. I think that is more in that diversity space than breeding. I mean, like I said in the presentation, I mean, our goal is to be providing value through that third option, four different ways in which farmers find value in germplasm. It's through the development of improved varieties. Now, of course, when it comes to more diversity, we're breeding across a range of crops, and the hope is that gives farmers more options across more crops, and so there can be diversity there. And beyond that, I mean, if we're giving them just different variety options that are each having in different ways value, then there's more options, and there's more good options, I suppose. But I think it's really the gene bank community that is probably more in that space of driving diversity, which I think is. I mean, I'm just trying to think back to the original question.
Right. Yeah. This is a similar question to before. Do the breeding programs help to characterize gene bank accessions, at least share the field data from your multi-location trials, which might add value to the gene bank collections for other programs, including NARS? Could the gene banks make it easier to share data back with them to make it public on their databases? In other words, again, it's basically the same question: is how can we take those useful traits that you have found across multiple locations and add value to the gene bank collection by including it in their databases? And I think you've answered that already. How does CG Gene Banks provide valuable patterns for professional and non-professional breeders? Not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. Sorry? How do CG Gene Banks provide valuable patterns for professional and non-professional breeders? Not sure what that means, and I think we'll skip over that one. This is from General Secretary Namrat, representing Chairman of Amri Brat Foundation Trust. We're an ABA involved in ecosystems to farmer in 7 states of India. We help farmers to convert them to organic farming, besides educating them on water harvesting. And the specific question is, after seeing our work in almost 9 out of 14 we would like to know how you can associate our organization with CGIAR for the better future of agriculture in India. And do we have a common goal? The question for Mr. Michael, best regards. Anyway, would like to associate this person from this organic farming situation Yes, I think, Michael, you've provided in your presentation, which will be shared with everybody that has registered, you will be providing your email address. So in case they have a chance to connect with you, you can see if you can add that collaborator
Yeah.
to your list, right? They work in 7
Yeah,
states.
sure.
Yeah, so perhaps it would be an interesting collaborator.
Yeah, and we have many collaborations with Indian colleagues, and happy to follow up to see how they can be included in the network. Yeah, that'd be great. And yes, the final slide has my email address on it. So when that slide deck is shared, please please look there for my email address for any further follow-ups. It's fine.
Okay, and with that, I think we're done with the questions. We have gone over time, and we thank you, Michael, first of all, for a wonderful presentation. Very useful to know your targets, the way you think. I mean, we had not heard from you, especially from the gene bank side. And we thank you for the time you spent preparing and presenting this presentation. To all of you participants, thank you very much for being with us today. We hope to see you maybe next month or the month afterwards in another Grow webinar. Faye, and the team at Crop Trust, thank you again for all your support. And the last words are for you, Michael.
Yeah, no, just thank you for all of your time to listen to me. I know that your time is very precious, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about CG breeding and what we're doing. It's an honor to be given this spot in your day to talk about this. So it's something I'm passionate about, CG breeding. So thank you for letting me talk to you about it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.